For 25 years, she smiled beside the most feared man in Seoul. She wore his name, carried his silence, and buried the grief of two sons stolen from her before she ever held them. Tonight, in front of 600 of the most powerful and dangerous people in the world, her husband plans to replace her with a younger woman and humiliate her out of existence. He thinks she will cry. He thinks she will beg. He has forgotten one crucial thing. The woman he stopped seeing years ago never stopped watching him. Like, comment your city below so I can see how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me until the very end, because tonight, the crane does not mourn. Tonight, the crane burns everything down.
Jesse was boss.
The dress was black, not the soft, forgiving black of a woman trying to disappear into a crowd. This was the black of deep water, of ink spilled on marble, of something that absorbed light and gave nothing back. It had been custom-made by a Parisian designer who owed Kioma Adeyemi a debt he could never fully repay, cut low enough to be architectural, high enough at the hem to allow movement, real movement, not the shuffling walk of women who wore clothes that wore them. The fabric caught the light of the Lotte Hotel's chandeliers as she stood before the mirror in Suite 4701, and for a long moment she did nothing except breathe. In, out, slow. Her reflection stared back at her. 51 years old, dark as polished ebony, cheekbones that could have been carved from obsidian, eyes that had spent 2 decades learning how to show nothing, the kind of beauty that didn't ask permission and didn't apologize for taking up space. She had looked this way at 26 when Kang Ji-tae first saw her at a Lagos investment summit and decided she would make him look civilized to the Western business world he was trying to penetrate. She had looked this way through every year of the marriage that followed. The difference was that at 26, the woman behind those eyes had still believed things could be different. She didn't believe that anymore. She picked up the lipstick from the vanity table. Deep red. She uncapped it slowly, twisted the base 3 times instead of 1, a specific motion, precise, and the bottom compartment clicked open. Inside, wrapped in a fold of tissue paper no larger than a thumbnail, sat her wedding ring. White gold. 3-carat center diamond. The ring Kang Ji-tae had slid onto her finger in a ceremony that cost more than most people earned in 10 years. She placed it in the compartment and clicked the base shut. Then she applied the lipstick. Behind her, in the living room of the suite, her personal assistant, a quiet Ghanaian woman named Abena, who had been with her for 11 years and who knew when to speak and when not to, was reviewing the evening schedule on a tablet. The gala began at 8. It was 7:42. "The car is ready?" Abena said without looking up. "I know." Mr. O confirmed he's in position. Kioma set down the lipstick. "And the others?" "All confirmed. 30 minutes out." She looked at herself in the mirror one final time. Not because she needed reassurance. She had not needed reassurance in a very long time. She looked because she wanted to remember this exact version of herself. The last version that existed before tonight changed everything. And she wanted to burn it into memory the way you burn the last photograph of a house before you set it on fire. "Let's go," she said. The ballroom of the Grand Crane Hall occupied the entire 42nd floor of the Kang Tower, the 60-story building in Gangnam that Kang Ji-tae had built 15 years ago and named after himself with the kind of shameless vanity that only truly powerful men could get away with. The Black Crane Syndicate's legitimate face, Kang Group Holdings, occupied the top 12 floors. The ballroom was used 4 times a year for events that mixed the legal and the criminal so seamlessly that foreign journalists who occasionally photographed the guest lists could never tell which was which. Tonight's event was the largest in the building's history. 640 guests. Politicians, including 2 sitting National Assembly members and the Deputy Governor of South Gyeongsang Province. CEOs of 7 of Korea's top 15 conglomerates. 3 foreign ambassadors whose governments would deny their attendance if asked. 43 individuals whose names appeared on no official guest list, but whose presence represented the criminal infrastructure of Northeast Asia. Syndicate captains, trafficking route controllers, money handlers, arms brokers. All of them here because Kang Ji-tae had summoned them, and when Kang Ji-tae summoned, people came. The official reason was the 25th wedding anniversary of Kang Ji-tae and Kioma Adeyemi Kang. The real reason, which everyone in the underworld, half of the room, already knew, was that tonight Jitai planned to publicly announce his new relationship, a message to the syndicate that succession was being reconfigured, that the era of the foreign wife was ending, and that a new order was beginning. Hyoma did not know they knew, or so her husband believed. She arrived at 8:03, which was 3 minutes later than the schedule Jitai had given her, and she did it deliberately. The entrance to the Grand Crane Hall was a set of 12-foot gold-plated doors that parted automatically when the sensors detected a guest's arrival. When those doors opened for Hyoma, the nearest 50 people turned to look simply because of the sound of her heels on the marble approach, a steady, unhurried rhythm that carried the same frequency as a judge walking to the bench. The room didn't go silent. That would come later. But heads turned and the conversations closest to the entrance stumbled and restarted, and 3 separate photographers raised their cameras because whatever else was happening tonight, this woman in this dress in this light was worth documenting. Kang Jitae was standing at the far end of the room near the elevated head table, deep in conversation with a man Hyoma recognized as Park Sung-chul, the syndicate's chief financial controller. Jitae was 63, lean and angular in the way of men who had always been more wire than muscle, with close-cropped silver hair and the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades being the most dangerous person in any room he entered. He wore a charcoal tuxedo with a black crane embroidered on the left lapel, the syndicate's symbol, worn openly at events like this because the legal and criminal worlds had long since blurred past the point of embarrassment. He didn't look up when she entered. He had stopped looking up when she entered rooms approximately 8 years ago. Hyoma accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server. She wouldn't drink it, hadn't drunk alcohol in 6 years, but the glass was useful as a prop, something to hold while her eyes moved across the room in patterns that looked casual and were not. She had spent years developing the skill of inventory taking disguised as social ease. She could catalog a room's threats, exits, loyalties, and pressure points in under 90 seconds while appearing to simply appreciate the floral arrangements. She spotted the first familiar face she'd been looking for near the West Bar. Min Jae-hyun, 61, one of Jitai's 3 most senior lieutenants, the man who controlled the syndicate's northern territories. His posture was wrong, too rigid, too watchful, the shoulders of a man waiting for something he'd been warned about. She spotted the second near the string quartet, Lee Dong-soo, Jitai's personal lawyer for 30 years and the architect of every corporate structure that kept the syndicate's money clean. He was drinking too fast for a man who was supposed to be enjoying an anniversary gala. She spotted the third, and this one mattered most. At a corner table with a view of both the main entrance and the service corridor, Han Seo-rin, 29 years old, the daughter of a minor Busan politician who had borrowed money from the syndicate and never fully repaid it. A woman whose face had been photographed on Jitai's arm at 4 different private events over the past 18 months, always at events where Hyoma was conveniently absent. Seo-rin was dressed in ivory, a choice that, at an anniversary gala, was not subtle, and she was positioned at precisely the table that had been placed in the sightline from the head table, which meant someone had designed her placement to be impossible to ignore. Hyoma looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked away and smiled at the wife of a National Assembly member who was approaching her with the bright, practiced warmth of someone who had no idea what kind of evening she was about to witness. "Hyoma, you look extraordinary. So do you, Hyunja. Is your husband well?" Small talk. The performance of it. She had been performing this particular act for so long that it required no conscious effort. It ran on a separate track while her mind remained elsewhere, calculating, moving pieces on a board that most people in this room didn't even know existed. At 8:45, Jitae finally crossed the room to her. He moved the way he always moved in public, with the contained, economical grace of a man who had trained himself never to appear rushed or uncertain. He was followed at a discreet distance by 2 of his personal security detail, large men in suits whose earpieces were visible to anyone paying attention. Most guests weren't paying attention. Hyoma always was. "You're late," he said when he reached her. Not a greeting, an opening statement. "By 3 minutes," she said. "I told you 8. "You told me a lot of things over the years." She smiled and sipped from the champagne glass she hadn't touched. "How are you, Jitae?" Something moved behind his eyes, a flash of something she might once have called uncertainty, but which she now recognized as recalibration, the micro-adjustment of a man who had expected a different response and was quickly updating his expectations. He had expected her to be nervous tonight. She could see the expectation written in the slight tension of his jaw, the way his gaze had briefly searched her face for signs of it. He found none. "You look well," he said, which was what he said when he had nothing real to say. "I always do," she replied. He excused himself after 40 seconds and moved back toward the head table, and Kiyoma watched his retreating back with the focused attention of a surgeon examining an X-ray. She had lived with this man for 25 years. She knew the set of his shoulders when he was confident, when he was uncertain, when he was performing confidence to mask uncertainty. Right now, his shoulders were performing, which meant something had already shifted, and he was starting to feel it, even if he didn't yet know what it was. Good. The dinner service began at 9. It was a 12-course kaiseki-inspired menu designed by a chef who had cooked for 3 heads of state and charged accordingly. The food was extraordinary. Kiyoma ate perhaps a third of what was placed in front of her, not because she wasn't hungry, but because eating required a kind of inward attention she couldn't afford tonight. Every bite, every sip of water, every moment her eyes dropped to her plate was a moment her peripheral vision went offline, and she couldn't afford offline moments. She was seated at the head table, to Jite's left. The seat to his right was formally empty, a breach of etiquette that every guest noticed, and that most of the underworld guests understood the significance of. That seat was waiting for someone. The question, to the uninitiated, was who? To Kiyoma, it wasn't a question. She watched Jite work the table, the easy charm he deployed when he needed people to feel comfortable, the way he could make a National Assembly member feel like the only person in the room while simultaneously monitoring 3 separate conversations happening 10 feet away. It was a skill she had respected once, in the early years, before she understood that the same skill that made him magnetic in a room made him lethal in private. Men who were very good at making people feel seen were often very good at making people disappear. She knew more about that than most. It had started with a phone call. Not tonight's events. Those had started years ago, had been building in increments too small to notice until you stepped back and saw the shape of what had been constructed. No, what Kiyoma was thinking of as she watched her husband charm a table of politicians and criminal lords was the phone call she had received 11 years ago while she was sitting in this same city, in the apartment Jite maintained for her in Hanam-dong, because the main residence felt too empty for daily living, and he was rarely there anyway. The call had come from a man named Osei Mensah, a Ghanaian financial investigator she had known briefly through her family's business networks in Lagos before her marriage. He was calling, he said, because he had stumbled across something that he believed she needed to know, and because he had spent 3 months deciding whether telling her was the right thing to do, and because in the end he had decided that a woman had the right to know if the children she believed were dead were actually alive. She had said nothing for 11 seconds after he told her. Then she had said, "Say that again." He said it again. The twins, born 35 weeks into a complicated pregnancy, delivered at a private clinic in Incheon, a clinic that Jite had specifically arranged after convincing Kiyoma that Seoul General didn't offer the level of privacy appropriate for a man of his position, had been registered as deceased in a fire that destroyed the clinic's records building 2 days after their birth. The fire investigation had been conducted by an official who, records later showed, had received a significant financial transfer from a shell company linked to Kang Group Holdings approximately 1 week after filing his report. The twins had not died in any fire. They had been removed from the clinic in the early hours of the morning following their birth, transported and placed with separate caregiving arrangements that Osei, through 3 years of painstaking financial archaeology, had traced to 2 different locations, one in Accra, one in Vancouver, before the trails had gone deliberately cold. Kiyoma had listened to all of this sitting perfectly still on a white sofa in the Hanam-dong apartment while the city moved outside her window, and her husband was somewhere in this same city, running the empire that had been more important to him than the sons she had spent 9 months carrying and 4 years grieving. When Osei finished, she had asked him one question. "Are they alive now?" "I believe so," he said. "But I can't confirm. The trail ends." "Then I need to find where it begins again," she said. That was 11 years ago. She had not found them immediately. She had not found them quickly. What she had done over the years that followed was construct carefully, patiently, invisibly, in the spaces that Jitai's indifference created, the infrastructure necessary to do two things simultaneously: find her sons and make sure that when she did, she would have something to offer them beyond a mother's grief. She had started with what she had. Her Nigerian family's connections were old and substantial. Her grandmother had been a market trader who turned a stall in Lagos into a regional commodity network, and that network had passed to Kioma's mother and then to Kioma's uncles and aunts in modified forms. Kioma herself had never been permitted by Jitai to maintain a meaningful business presence. He had preferred her decorative and uninvested, a wife who attended events and did not interfere, but the family connections had remained, maintained through phone calls and carefully written letters, and the occasional trip to Lagos that she had always framed as homesickness, and Jitai had always permitted because a wife who occasionally visited family was less likely to cause domestic friction. Those trips were not homesickness. Those trips were board meetings. Over 7 years, using her family's networks as the roots and an international investment vehicle registered in Mauritius as the trunk, she had quietly grown a financial entity that did not look like what it was. It looked like a mid-sized African investment fund with interests in logistics, real estate, and emerging market commodities. It was, in reality, the financial spine of a much larger organism, one that had begun carefully, slowly, over years, to extend its reach into the corporate structures of companies that had significant business relationships with Kang Group Holdings. She had not moved against Jitai. Not once. Not until she was ready. Being ready required finding her sons first. She found Cairo 4 years after Ose's call through a financial signature, a particular style of analysis in a commodities trading report that she recognized instinctively as something that could not have been taught, something that was simply the way a mind worked, and a mind that worked that way had to come from somewhere. She had followed the signature to a consulting firm in Accra, and then to a specific analyst within that firm, and then to that analyst's personnel file, and then to a birth certificate that had been partially falsified but not perfectly, and then to a photograph. She had sat with the photograph for 4 hours before she called anyone. Cairo was 22 in the photograph. He looked like her father. Finding Cassius took 2 more years, and it was Cairo who ultimately found him, because once she had reached her first son, she had told him everything. And Cairo, who turned out to be exactly the kind of man that losing a mother made you, had spent the subsequent 2 years doing what she had been doing for 7, following a trail with the patience of someone who understood that some things could not be rushed. Cassius was in Vancouver. He had built a small but ferociously efficient logistics company from nothing by the age of 24. When Cairo finally reached him and explained who he was and what their mother had told him, Cassius had been quiet for a long time. Then he had asked, "What does she need from us?" Not what did they need from her. What did she need from them? Kioma, when Cairo told her this, had excused herself from the call and cried for the first time in 6 years. Alone, in a bathroom in a hotel in Nairobi, she pressed both hands against the cool tile and let herself feel the full weight of 20 years of loss and the impossible relief of finding it unexpectedly, terrifyingly intact. She allowed herself 14 minutes. Then she washed her face, went back to the phone, and told her sons exactly what she needed. What? The orchestra was playing something slow and European when Jitai stood at 9:58. The room quieted by reflex. Jitai standing was an event that trained 600 people to pay attention. He raised his glass, and the remaining conversation died away completely. And in the silence, Kioma felt the room's weight shift, the way it shifted before weather changed. She set her champagne glass down. Her hands were completely steady. 25 years ago, Jitai began, I married a woman who made me look good. He said it with the easy, self-deprecating humor he deployed when he wanted an audience to relax. People chuckled. He continued, in this business, in all the businesses we run together in this room, appearance matters. A man of influence needs a foundation, and Kioma gave me that foundation. She was the picture that made people believe the frame was worth something. A pause. Kioma watched the room. She could see the underworld guests recalibrate slightly. That sentence had been sharper than expected, less celebratory. But 25 years is a long time, Jitai continued, and a man who doesn't grow doesn't survive. I've spent my life adapting, replacing what no longer serves the future. That is, I think, the most honest thing I can say about how I have built what I've built. He turned finally to look directly at Kioma. My wife has been loyal. She has been present. She has been beautiful. And she has been, for 25 years, exactly what I needed her to be. The emphasis on the past tense was not subtle. She felt it land across the room like a stone thrown into water. The ripple of understanding moving outward through the guests, faces shifting between discomfort and fascination. The prurient attention of people who were about to watch something happen that they would be talking about for years. Jitai extended his hand toward the corner table. Tonight, I want to introduce someone who represents what the next chapter looks like. Seorin stood. Ivory dress. Young and certain and already moving toward the head table with the careful walk of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times. The room held its breath. Kioma picked up her water glass. She stood. The movement was unhurried. Architectural, the same word that the dress had suggested earlier. She rose to her full height, 5'9" in heels that added another 3 inches. And she did not look at Seorin, and she did not look at Jitai. She looked at the orchestra. "Could you play something for me?" she said. Her voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. The room's silence carried it the way water carries sound, clearly, without distortion, to every corner. The orchestra conductor, a small Korean man who had been hired specifically for this evening and who had received a very specific instruction sheet 3 weeks ago from a contact he'd never met in person, looked up at her. "Of course, Mrs. Kang," he said. "Which piece?" Kioma smiled. And when she smiled, it was the smile of a woman who had been keeping this particular expression in reserve for a very long time. "The crane never mourns twice," she said. The conductor nodded once and raised his baton. The music began. It was not a piece anyone in the room recognized, because it had been commissioned 18 months ago by a music foundation in Vienna whose principal donor was a Mauritius-registered investment entity, and it had been written specifically for this evening. But it was unmistakably powerful. Strings first, low and deliberate, with the kind of harmonic weight that made people feel in their chests before they understood it in their minds. Jitai stared at her. Seorin had stopped walking. 25 years, Kioma said, still looking at the orchestra, her voice carrying the same effortless clarity as before. "That's a long time to build something." She turned to face the room. Not Jitai specifically. The room, all 600 of them. The politicians and the criminals and the CEOs and the foreign ambassadors. "Would you like to hear about what was built?" No one spoke. She set down the water glass. She smoothed the front of her black dress with one hand. She breathed in through her nose, slow and full. 24 years ago, she began. "I gave birth to twin sons in a clinic in Incheon. They were small, born early, as twins often are, but they were alive. Both of them. I held one of them for 7 minutes before a nurse took him to be weighed, and I never held either of them again." The room was so silent that the strings of the orchestra filled every available inch of it. "I was told there was a fire. I was told the records were lost. I was told my sons were gone. And I spent 4 years believing that, because when the man who controls everything you have access to tells you something is true, you believe it. You grieve it. You carry it the way you carry the things that cannot be undone." Jitai had gone very still. "I was wrong," Kioma said. "Not about the grief. About the truth." She reached into the small black clutch on the table in front of her and removed a folded document. She unfolded it once and held it toward the room, not reading from it, just holding it, the way you hold evidence when you want people to understand that what you're saying is not performance. "My sons are alive," she said. The room broke open. Not loudly, not the burst of a crowd at a sporting event. It broke the way ice breaks, a deep structural fracture that ran through everything, all at once, with a sound that was more felt than heard. 63 separate conversations began simultaneously. Jitai's 2 security guards moved closer to him by reflex. Lee Dong-soo, the lawyer, knocked his wine glass off the table, and the crash of it on the marble floor was the loudest sound in the room for one brief second. Jitai said nothing. His face had done something she had never seen it do in 25 years. It had gone blank. Completely, entirely blank. Not the controlled blankness of a man choosing not to react, but the blank of a man whose mind had just encountered information it had no prepared response for. The blank of someone who had been certain of something for 24 years and was now watching that certainty come apart at the molecular level. Kioma folded the document and placed it back in her clutch. "I'll pause there," she said pleasantly, "for the moment." The orchestra played on, and at the gold-plated entrance doors of the Grand Crane Hall, something began to happen. The doors, which had been closed since the dinner began, were moving, not opened by a staff member, not triggered by a censor, opened from the outside by two people whose entrance had not appeared on any guest list, whose names had been on no seating chart, and whose existence in this city on this night was something that Kang Ji-tai, for all his intelligence, for all his 25 years of controlling every variable in every room he ever occupied, had not anticipated. The doors swung wide. Two young men walked in. Identical height, identical jaw, identical eyes, Kioma's eyes, unmistakably, set in faces that were different enough to be individuals and similar enough to be mirrors of each other. They wore cream-colored suits that had no business being in a room full of black and charcoal, and they walked with the particular unhurried certainty of people who had been moving toward this moment for years and had no intention of rushing it now that it had arrived. The room saw them. The room saw their faces. The room looked at Kioma. The room looked back at the young men. Jitai turned. The color left his face. The two young men walked the full length of the ballroom without looking at anyone except each other and their mother. They walked past the head table, past Kang Ji-tai, past Seo Rin, who had pressed herself against the nearest wall and whose ivory dress suddenly looked less like a statement and more like a mistake. They walked to where Kioma stood, and the taller one, by perhaps half an inch, leaned down and pressed his lips to his mother's forehead. Then the other one did the same. Kioma closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When she opened them, the room was watching her sons with the expression of people who were trying to process something that exceeded their available categories. The taller one straightened and looked at the room. "My name," he said, in Korean so clear and precise it carried the weight of someone who had learned the language specifically for this moment, "is Cairo Adeyemi." The other one looked at Jitai. "And I'm Cassius," he said. In English, flat, direct, with a Vancouver accent that had been roughened by years of working shipping docks before the company he built could afford offices. "We have some things to discuss." The orchestra stopped playing. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Kioma had heard in 25 years. And in that silence, in the held breath of 600 people who had come to watch a woman be discarded and were now watching something else entirely, Cairo opened his jacket and removed a folder of documents that had the logo of one of Korea's largest financial auditing firms on the cover. And he set it on the head table directly in front of Kang Ji-tae, and he said very quietly, "You might want to look at page 7 first." Ji-tae's hand moved toward the folder and stopped, because his phone was vibrating, and then Lee Dong-soo's phone was vibrating, and then Min Jae-hyun's phone across the room, and two of the syndicate captains at the east tables, and the CFO of Kang Group Holdings, who was seated near the window with a view of the Han River, all of their phones going off simultaneously, emergency notifications from systems and accounts and legal entities that should not have been generating emergency notifications at 9:58 on a Tuesday night. Ji-tai looked down at his phone. He looked up at Kioma. She looked back at him with the patience of a woman who had been waiting 24 years for this exact moment and was in absolutely no hurry. "Page 7, Cairo said again. Ji-tai opened the folder. Page 7 was a spreadsheet. Not a simple one. It was the kind of document that took someone with Cairo's specific training. 7 years of financial analysis, 3 of them spent specifically reverse engineering the corporate architecture of Kang Group Holdings to construct, and it took someone with Ji-tai's specific knowledge of his own empire to fully understand what he was looking at. The columns were clean, the numbers were precise, the trail of ownership transfers, share acquisitions, and silent proxy arrangements ran down the page in a sequence that was almost elegant in the way that very dangerous things sometimes were. Ji-tae read it once. He read it again. His breathing had changed. Kioma could see it from where she stood. The almost imperceptible deepening of each inhale, the slight delay before each exhale. The physiological signature of a man whose mind was working very fast and whose body was struggling to keep pace. She had seen him afraid before, twice in 25 years, and it looked nothing like this. What she was watching now was something closer to the specific terror of a man who had spent his entire life believing he had accounted for every variable and was now holding proof that he had miscounted. This isn't... He stopped, restarted. These numbers aren't accurate, Cairo said. He was still standing. He hadn't sat down, hadn't asked for a chair, hadn't done anything that would suggest he planned to be in this room any longer than necessary. They are. You can call your CFO right now if you want to verify. Although I notice his phone is still going off, so he might be a little distracted. Across the room, the CFO, a heavy-set man named Bae Chun-ho, who had been with Jitai for 19 years and who had the particular look of a man who had built his identity entirely on competence, was standing away from his table with his phone pressed to his ear, his face the color of old concrete, speaking in rapid, low Korean to someone on the other end who was clearly not giving him good news. Jitai looked at him. Bae Chun-ho looked back at Jitai. The look between them lasted maybe 3 seconds and communicated something that made 3 of the nearest guests quietly push their chairs back from their tables. "What did you do?" Jitai said. He was looking at Kiyoma now. Not a question. The grammar was wrong for a question, the inflection wrong, the weight of it entirely wrong. It was the sentence of a man who already knew approximately what had been done and was still trying to make his mind accept the scale of it. "What you taught me," Kiyoma said. "I adapted." Cassius moved for the first time since they'd arrived. Not dramatically, just a shift in weight, a slight adjustment of his position that placed him 2 feet closer to the left side of the head table. It was the movement of someone who had spent years working in environments where reading a room correctly was the difference between walking out under your own power and not walking out at all. He'd learned it on shipping docks, in freight yards, in Vancouver's industrial port, in meetings with men who moved things across borders and needed to believe he was one of them. He wasn't afraid of this room. That was the thing Jitai's face showed he hadn't expected. Not in either of them. He had expected anger, maybe. Grief weaponized. The ragged, improvised vengeance of people acting from damage. What he was looking at instead was something far more unsettling. 2 young men who had arrived here completely prepared, which meant they had known about this night long enough to prepare for it, which meant his intelligence operation, which he had considered impenetrable, had been compromised in ways he was only beginning to calculate. "Sit down," Kiyoma said to him. He stared at her. "Jitai," she said. "Sit down, you're embarrassing yourself." The 600 guests of the Grand Crane Hall's anniversary gala had, by this point, organized themselves into 3 categories. The first, diplomats, legitimate CEOs, the ambassador contingent, were frozen in the specific paralysis of people who had arrived at an event expecting cocktails and polite speeches and were now sitting inside something that felt considerably more consequential than their security protocols had prepared them for. Several of them had already texted their security details in the lobby. The second category, the politicians, were doing what politicians always did, which was watching all available faces simultaneously and not committing to any expression until they had a clearer sense of which way the room was going to fall. The third category, the syndicate people, had gone very quiet in the way of professionals who understood that in a room where power was actively transferring, visibility was a liability. Min Jae-hyun, the senior lieutenant, had put his phone away. He was standing near the west bar with his arms at his sides and his face arranged into the careful neutrality of a man who had not yet decided what this evening meant for him personally. Jitai sat. Not because Kiyoma told him to, because his legs made the decision before his pride could override them, which was its own kind of information. Lee Dong-soo, the lawyer, moved toward the head table from his seat near the string quartet. Quickly, with the purposeful walk of a man who had spent 30 years inserting himself between Jitai and consequences. He was 67, thin, with the particular dryness of someone who had spent decades in rooms where words were weapons and had developed a kind of lizard economy of motion, nothing wasted. "This is not the appropriate venue," he began. "Sit down, Mr. Lee," Cassius said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. There was something in the register of it. Not a threat exactly, more the quality of a statement made by someone who had already done the arithmetic on every possible response and was comfortable with all the outcomes. "We're not here to talk to you." Lee Dong-soo looked at Jitai. Jitai gave him a look that said nothing clearly, which was itself a kind of answer. The lawyer sat. Kioma moved for the first time since her sons had entered the room. She walked around the head table, not hurrying, not performing, just moving with the specific directional weight of someone going somewhere they had always been going. And she pulled out the chair immediately to Jitae's right, the chair that had been waiting all evening for Seo-rin. She sat in it. She looked at her husband from a distance of approximately 18 inches, which was the closest she had been to him voluntarily in 3 years. "You want to know how much?" she said. His jaw tightened. "Not the full number," she continued. "You know the full number now, or you will in about 20 minutes when Chunho finishes getting the complete picture. I mean, how long?" She folded her hands on the table in front of her, which was a gesture she had learned from her grandmother, who had used it in market negotiations to signal that she was done moving and was now prepared to be still until the other side broke. "How long have I been doing this?" Jitae said nothing. 9 years, she said. The first 3 were reconnaissance. I needed to understand the structure before I could find the weak points. Your corporate architecture is genuinely impressive. Lee here built something that would have kept most people out for a generation. She glanced at the lawyer briefly, not unkindly. But it was designed to keep regulators out. It wasn't designed for someone who already knew which doors existed. "You're inside this building," Jitae said. His voice was very controlled. That control was costing him something. She could see the cost in the slight tension of his throat, the way he was breathing through his nose in a pattern that suggested someone consciously managing their own chemistry. "You are in my building. Everything you're describing, the transfers, the acquisitions, they're all reversible. You know that." "Some of them," Kioma agreed. Page 14. Cairo, who had been standing behind his mother with the patience of someone who had rehearsed for this specific sequence, reached across and turned to page 14. Jitae looked at it. The sound he made was not quite a word. It was the sound a very controlled man makes when his control slips for half a second against his will. A short, involuntary exhalation that carried in it the full weight of what he was reading. Page 14 was a list of the syndicate's criminal operational nodes. Not the corporate structures, those were page 7, but the actual infrastructure. 12 key positions across the Black Crane Network's operational chain. Not the people. The positions, the roles, the nodes that the information and money and physical logistics all pass through. Beside each position was a name. Not Jitae's original people. New names, most of them unknown to him, with dates of transition going back as far as 4 years. "Cassius has been in the logistics business for 6 years, Kioma said quietly. "It took him approximately 2 of those years to identify that your northern shipping operations had a structural vulnerability in the Incheon to Busan corridor. It took him another year to build the alternative infrastructure that your route controllers found more efficient and considerably more profitable to work with. By the time your people realized they were working for a different network, they had been doing it for 8 months. Jitae looked at Cassius. Cassius looked back at him. There was nothing hostile in the look. That was the thing that was hardest to process. Neither of the twins was performing hatred or triumph or the raw emotional heat of men who had been wronged and were taking satisfaction in the writing of it. They were calm in the way that structures are calm, the way a building that has been standing for years is calm, not because nothing has happened to it, but because what has happened to it has only made it more solid. "My people would have told me," Jitae said. It came out sounding less certain than he'd intended. "Your people told you what they were paid to tell you," Cassius said. Some of them were paying closer attention to who was paying more. The room was still listening, the whole room, all 600 of them, even the ones who had moved toward the exits in the first minutes after the twins' entrance, had stilled themselves again, drawn back by the specific gravity of what was happening at the head table. This was not the kind of thing you watched from a distance if you could help it. This was the kind of thing that determined what the next 5 years looked like for every person in the room who had a financial or operational connection to the Black Crane Syndicate. Min Jae-hyun had moved, not dramatically. He had simply relocated from the West Bar to a position approximately 12 feet closer to the head table. His arms were still at his sides. His face was still carefully neutral. But the direction of his movement was information, and Kioma registered it the way she registered everything, completely, without reaction. Jitae saw it too. "Jae-hyun," he said. Min Jae-hyun didn't answer immediately. The pause lasted perhaps 4 seconds, which was, in the specific economy of this room, an enormous amount of time. Chairman, he said finally. The word landed wrong. The room heard it. The word was correct. Jite was still technically the chairman of Kang Group Holdings, or had been until approximately 40 minutes ago when the first of the transfer documents had cleared, but the tone was the tone of a man who was using a title to buy himself time, not to affirm loyalty. Jite heard it. Kyoma saw him hear it in the brief stillness that moved through him like a current. 23 years. He and Min Jae-hyun had been together for 23 years. That was the kind of relationship that you didn't just lose to a spreadsheet. And yet, Kyoma let the silence stretch for exactly the amount of time it needed to, which was the skill her grandmother had given her. Not the ability to manufacture silence, but the ability to let it do its work without flinching. Then Jitai pushed back from the table. He stood, and the movement was fast enough and sudden enough that 2 of his security detail took a reflexive step forward, and 3 of the nearest guests physically flinched, and Seo Rin, who had remained pressed against the far wall this entire time, in a posture that had moved through several stages of emotion and arrived somewhere in the vicinity of very small, made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Jitai didn't look at her. He looked at Kyoma. Outside, he said. No, she said. That one syllable, the simplest possible answer, said without heat, without satisfaction, without any of the emotional charge that he had expected and was prepared to use against her, because a woman making an emotional argument was a woman he knew how to manage, and he had been managing emotions in this marriage for 25 years. What he was not prepared for was the specific quality of that no. The no of a woman who had made her decision in this room and had no intention of moving it to a more private venue where 600 witnesses would not be watching. Everything I have to say to you, Kyoma said, I've already spent 9 years saying in the only language you understand, which is money. She looked at the folder still open in front of him. The rest is just paperwork. Jitae's hand came down on the table. Not a fist. Open palm, flat, hard. The sound of it cracked across the nearest 15 feet of room and made the champagne glasses nearest to him ring against each other. It was the first uncontrolled thing she had seen him do in 25 years. You think you can... He stopped himself, the control reasserting. But the effort was visible now, cost no longer hidden, and the room that was watching him saw the cost and recalibrated accordingly. You think this is finished? These documents? The transfers? I have lawyers. I have... Lee, Cassius said. The lawyer looked at him. Tell him about the Mauritius filings. Lee Dong-su's expression did something complicated. He was 67 years old and had been in difficult rooms before, had managed crises that would have unraveled lesser men, had kept secrets for 3 decades that could have destroyed governments. He was not a man who showed things on his face without choosing to. What appeared there now was not panic. It was the expression of a man confronting the specific professional humiliation of realizing that a structure he believed was impenetrable had been penetrated from the inside, and that he was being asked to confirm this by someone sitting 20 feet away who probably knew more about the internal mechanics of it than he did. The Mauritius filings, he said slowly, are structured in a way that makes a direct reversal process complicated. Complicated, Jite repeated. The filing dates precede the contestation window by how long? Silence. How long, Dong-su? The primary transfer window closed 14 months ago, the lawyer said. The secondary window closed 6 months ago. To reverse the current ownership structure of the entities listed on pages 7 through 11, we would need to demonstrate fraud or duress in the original transfer instruments, which would require... He paused. Which would require evidence of fraud. The instruments were clean. Because I was very careful, Cairo said. Not boasting, stating. Jite turned to look at his eldest son, the word landing in his mind with the particular wrongness of a shoe on the wrong foot, a word that didn't fit the shape of anything he'd prepared himself to feel. And the look between them was the most complex thing that had happened in the room all evening, which was saying something. Cairo met it. He didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't offer anything that could be read as an opening. He had his mother's eyes and his mother's stillness, and something else, something that was entirely his own, built in the years of doing this work without anyone to do it with. that looked like the specific self-possession of a man who had processed his anger long ago, on his own time, and arrived at this room already on the other side of it. "You don't know me," Jitai said. "No," Cairo agreed. "I don't." The flatness of it was worse than anything emotional would have been. Jitai's phone buzzed again. He looked down. The number on the screen was one that meant the Northern Operations Controller was calling personally, which was the kind of thing that happened approximately once every 3 years under normal circumstances, and which happening right now meant the notifications Cassius's network had triggered were cascading through the operational chain faster than damage control could manage. He silenced it. He looked at the room, the whole room. The 600 guests, the politicians, and the criminals and the CEOs, all of them watching him with the specific attention of people who were simultaneously fascinated and calculating their own positions. He had stood in front of rooms like this for 30 years. He had controlled rooms like this for 30 years. He knew what it felt like to be the gravitational center of a space like this one. He knew what it felt like not to be. That was the thing. That was the thing that moved through him in those 3 seconds of looking at the room and feeling the room looking back. And it was not quite fear. Fear was too simple, too animal for what it was. It was the specific vertigo of a man who had organized his entire existence around the certainty of his own power and was now standing in the first room of his life, where that certainty was genuinely, structurally, irreversibly absent. He looked at Kioma. She was watching him with the patience of someone who had been watching him for a very long time and finally had the luxury of letting him see her do it. "There's one thing you haven't accounted for," he said. "Tell me." "I'm still alive," he said. "And I still have people in this room who work for me. Not for her," the pronoun sharp directed toward an indeterminate space that encompassed both Kioma and the financial apparatus she had built. "For me. And a man with the right people in the right positions can rebuild." It was the most honest thing he'd said all evening. Kioma nodded slowly. "You're right," she said. "That's true." He waited for the rest of it. "That's why we're not finished yet," she said. She turned to Cassius. Cassius reached inside his jacket. He removed a phone and placed it face up on the table, and he pressed play on a video file that had been queued and waiting, and the sound that came out of it, a conversation, 2 voices, Korean spoken in the particular register of men who believed they were not being recorded, filled the immediate area around the head table with the clarity of a high-quality recording made in a small room. The first voice was immediately recognizable to everyone within earshot. It was Jitai's. The second voice, older, rougher, with the specific accent of the Busan Port District, was the voice of a man named Yoon Tae-gwan, who had been the medical director of the Incheon Clinic 24 years ago, and who had, according to his own recorded words in the audio now playing on Cassius's phone, personally supervised the removal and transfer of 2 infant boys on the direct instruction of the man paying the clinic's operating costs, in exchange for a financial arrangement that had been maintained in periodic payments for the subsequent 22 years. The audio was 4 minutes and 17 seconds long. It played in its entirety. When it ended, the silence was the kind that has weight. Jitai had not moved during the playback, had not spoken, had not looked at the phone or away from it consistently. His gaze had drifted the way the gaze of a person in shock sometimes drifts, moving without landing, searching for something to hold on to in a visual field that has become somehow destabilizing. The sound of his own voice describing the logistics of removing his newborn sons from their mother's reach, and the careful financial engineering of keeping that secret for 2 decades, had a quality that no amount of preparation for this moment could have fully insulated him from. He was hearing himself as the room heard him. That was the thing that no one could armor against. Min Jae-hyun, from his position 12 feet away, let out a slow breath through his nose. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked at Kioma. And then he did something that no one in the room, not Kioma, not her sons, not any of the 600 guests, had been certain he would do. He took 2 steps toward the head table, not toward Jitai's side of it, toward hers. He stopped there and stood with his hands clasped in front of him, and he said nothing because nothing needed to be said. The movement was the statement. The movement was everything. 2 of the syndicate captains from the East tables followed, then a third. Jitai watched it happen, watched the room's gravity shift in real time, watched the men who had operated under his authority for years reorient themselves toward the new center of this room with the pragmatic efficiency of professionals who understood that loyalty in their business was always, ultimately, structural. It followed the structure that was standing, and right now the structure that was standing was not him. His hands were on the table, both of them flat, pressing down, as if he needed the resistance of the surface to keep himself from doing something that would make this worse. And there were things he could do. There were always things a man like him could do, even in moments like this, because men like him cultivated options the way other people cultivated relationships. And some of those options were sitting in this room right now, watching the same transfer of power that everyone else was watching and waiting to see if the order came. The order didn't come, because somewhere between reading page 7 and hearing the audio playthrough and watching Min Jae-hyun walk across a ballroom floor, something in Kang Ji-tae had made a calculation. It was not a moral calculation. He had not become a different man in the last 40 minutes. It was the calculation of a man who had survived by being better than everyone else at reading rooms. And the room was telling him something that his pride could not override. That whatever came next, it was not going to happen here. He picked up his phone. He made a call. The person on the other end answered immediately. "Get the car ready," Jite said. "Side entrance." He ended the call. He looked at Kiyoma. He looked at his sons. The word still that wrong shape in his mind, still not fitting the space where it needed to go, and he said nothing to any of them, because there was nothing to say that was not already being said by every other element of this room, and he had enough self-knowledge left to understand that. He pushed back from the table. He walked. Not running. He would not run. But he walked with a directness and speed that cleared a path through the nearest guests by the force of his forward motion alone, his 2 security guards falling in behind him, and he moved toward the service corridor exit at the far left of the ballroom, and the path he took to get there was the longest walk of his 63 years, and he felt the room watching him take it with every single step. Seo Rin, pressed against the far wall in her ivory dress, watched him pass. He did not look at her. She had been, in the end, exactly what he had called her, a next chapter, a plan. And the plan had been dismantled before the evening was over. She watched him disappear through the service door. Then she looked at Kiyoma. Something moved across her face. Not quite what Kiyoma expected. Not the petulance of a woman scorned. Not the anger of someone whose position had just evaporated. It was something more complicated than that, and more human, and it lasted only a second before Seorin straightened her spine and walked toward the main exit with her head up and her hands steady. Whatever her story was, it was not over. But that was for another night. Kiyoma watched the service door settle back into its frame where Jitai had passed through it. She breathed. The room was still full, still watching, still waiting for the next thing to happen, because 600 people who had witnessed what they just witnessed were not going to simply pick up their forks and return to the 12th course. Not yet. Not until there was something more to hold on to. Kiyoma turned to face them, and Cairo's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something moved in his expression. Not panic, but a sharpening. The look of someone who had been waiting for a specific call and was now recalibrating the timeline because it was arriving earlier than expected. He showed the screen to Cassius. Cassius looked at it, and his jaw tightened by a fraction that only someone who knew his face well would catch. "Mom," Cairo said quietly. She turned to him. "The Incheon facility," he said. "Jitai's people just... the lights went out. All of them. The chandeliers, the table candles, the accent lighting, the exit signs, everything, simultaneously, in the specific totality of a building-level power interruption that was not an accident and was not a malfunction and had been triggered deliberately by someone with access to the building's core electrical systems who had decided that darkness was the best available option right now. 600 people in a windowless ballroom, suddenly and completely dark. In the 3 seconds before the emergency lighting flickered on, dim, red-tinted, barely enough to see shapes, Kiyoma felt the room's fear spike like a physical thing, heard the sharp collective inhale of hundreds of people simultaneously processing the same threat, heard the crash of at least 2 chairs, a glass breaking, someone saying something in Korean that was too fast and too urgent to catch. The emergency lights came up. Kiyoma was still at the head table. Her sons were still on either side of her, both of them having moved in the darkness to positions that bracketed her, which she registered with something she didn't have time to name properly. Cairo's phone was at his ear. Talk to me, he said into it. His face in the red emergency light was the face of a man hearing something that was changing the shape of the next several hours. And whatever it was not good. And it was not something they had planned for. And Kioma, who had planned for almost everything, who had spent 9 years planning for almost everything, felt the first cold touch of the unaccounted variable reach her. The emergency lights turned the ballroom into something that looked like the inside of a wound, red-tinted, low, casting shadows that moved when people moved, and made the 600 guests look like shapes rather than individuals, masses of color and motion, without clean edges, without the certainty that normal light provided. Someone near the east tables was crying, not loudly. The specific quiet crying of someone trying not to be heard, which in the sudden acoustic flatness of a space with no music and no ventilation hum, was somehow more audible than it would have been with full sound coverage. Cairo had the phone pressed hard against his ear. His free hand was flat on the table, fingers spread, a gesture Kioma recognized as a physical anchor, something to press against while the mind processed. She had done it herself years ago, in a hotel bathroom in Nairobi, both palms against cool tile. "Say that again," he said into the phone. His voice was very controlled, the kind of controlled that required active construction. Cassius moved closer. Not to hear the call, he couldn't hear it, but because his brother's face was doing something that warranted proximity. He had learned to read Cairo's face over 4 years of working alongside him, 4 years of building something enormous and complicated and fragile in the specific way that all enormous complicated things were fragile. And what Cairo's face was doing right now was the thing it did when the arithmetic stopped working. Kioma watched both of them. "How many?" Cairo said. A pause. "How many people, Osei?" Another pause, longer. Cairo lowered the phone. He didn't end the call. He just lowered it, held it at his side, and stood in the red emergency light of the ballroom, looking at the table in front of him with the expression of a man who was standing at the edge of a very specific kind of drop and understanding, for the first time, exactly how far down it went. "Cairo," Cassius said. "The Mauritius accounts," Cairo said. His voice was flat, the flatness that precedes something difficult. "What about them?" Kioma said. He looked up at her. 3 of the primary holding entities have been flagged by the Korean Financial Intelligence Unit. Tonight. Within the last 40 minutes. He paused. It's not a routine flag. It's an emergency seizure notice. Someone filed a criminal complaint this afternoon, before the gala started, alleging that the transfer instruments were fraudulent, that the acquisitions were made under false representation. The room around them was still processing its own chaos. Guests moving toward exits, security teams communicating in low voices, the syndicate captains who had moved toward Kioma's side of the table, now exchanging rapid looks that were recalibrating again, faster, the way that pragmatic men recalibrated when the structure they'd just moved toward showed its first signs of instability. "Who filed it?" Cassius said. Cairo looked at him. "Who filed the complaint, Cairo?" "Lee Dong-soo," Cairo said. "He filed it at 4:17 this afternoon." The silence between the 3 of them lasted approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds in which Kioma understood. Not gradually, not in pieces, but all at once. The way structural collapse happens. The whole thing simultaneously. That Lee Dong-soo had known before the gala began, had sat at that table through the entire evening's events, through the audio playback, through Min Jae-hyun's crossing of the floor, through Jitai's exit, and had said nothing, because he had already done what he needed to do 4 hours ago, and everything that followed was theater he was willing to watch. She thought about the look on his face when Cassius had said his name, the complicated expression she had read as professional humiliation. It hadn't been humiliation. It had been the expression of a man who was waiting to see if his contingency had been triggered in time. "Where is he?" she said. Cairo looked around the ballroom. The emergency lighting made it difficult. Shapes, masses, movement without definition. Lee Dong-soo was not at his table. Lee Dong-soo was not near the string quartet where he had been sitting. Lee Dong-soo was not visible anywhere in the ballroom. "He's gone," Cassius said. Not surprised. The tone of a man filing a fact. Kioma pressed both hands flat on the table. The tile memory, the Nairobi memory. She pushed it down, pushed all of it down, because there was no time for the physical language of shock right now. No time for her body to do what it wanted to do. She needed to think in a straight line, and she needed to do it in the next 30 seconds. Because 30 seconds was approximately how long they had before the situation in this room reached a stage where external control, police, financial regulators, the kind of official presence that Jitai had spent 30 years keeping out of his affairs, became inevitable. The secondary holding entities, she said, the ones not in Mauritius, the direct Korean registrations. They're clean, Cairo said. The KFIU notice only covers the Mauritius vehicles. How much of the total structure does that represent? He hesitated. Cairo, how much? 63% of the acquisition value, he said. The Mauritius entities hold the controlling positions in the Kang Group subsidiary chain. The Korean registrations hold the logistics network and the real estate holdings, but not the tower, Cassius said. Not the tower, not the broadcasting licenses, not the finance arm. Kiyoma straightened. Her spine went vertical with the specific deliberateness of a woman choosing not to allow her body to express what her mind was processing. She looked at the ballroom around her, the 600 guests in the red light, the chaos settling into the specific kind of ordered panic that preceded people making decisions they couldn't take back. The syndicate men who had moved toward her position now drifting slightly, the way that iron filings drift when the magnet underneath the surface shifts. She had built 9 years of work on a foundation that she had believed was airtight. And Lee Dong-soo, 67 years old, 30 years of building legal architecture for the most dangerous man in Seoul, a man whose entire professional identity was the impenetrability of the structures he created, had found the seam. Had found it, and had filed his complaint 4 hours before the gala began, which meant he had known the gala was the trigger event, which meant that Jitai had known longer than tonight that something was coming, which meant he was warned, she said. Cairo looked at her. Jitai was warned, not tonight, before. Someone in our structure told him something was being built. She kept her voice very low. The nearest guests were 10 feet away and occupied with their own fear, but 10 feet in a quiet room was not enough distance for this conversation. Not enough to stop it, not enough to dismantle it, but enough to give Lee time to build a contingency. Osei, Cassius said immediately. No. She was certain of this, not because sentiment told her so, but because she knew Osei Mensa's motivations down to their molecular level, and none of them ran toward Kang Ji-tai. Not Osei. Then who had enough access? She thought about who had known. Really known. Not the fragments that various people held, the partial pictures that she had been careful to distribute in segments precise enough to be useful, but not complete enough to be dangerous on their own. She thought about who had seen enough of the whole map to tell Jitai that something was coming without being able to tell him exactly what. The answer arrived, and she didn't want it. It arrived with the specific quality of knowledge that you recognize before you finish thinking it, because your body knows the shape of it before your mind has assembled the words. Abena, she said. The name came out quiet, almost inaudible, but Cassius heard it, and his expression did something she had not seen it do before. Not in 4 years of working alongside him, not in all the difficult moments of building what they had built together. It went soft for 1 second, the softness of someone who understood what a word like that cost, and then it hardened back into the face he used for work. You're sure? He said. No, she said, but she's the only person who saw the full timeline. The only person who knew the gala was the execution date. I kept the date from Osei until 10 days ago. I kept it from the legal team until a week ago. Abena has known since March. March. 8 months ago. 8 months of sitting beside Kiyoma in this city, managing her calendar and her communications, and her access to the financial network's operational layer. 8 months of being the person who knew where everything was. Why? Cairo said. Not asking Kiyoma, asking the room, the universe, the specific senselessness of it. Money, Cassius said, or fear. Usually one or the other. Kiyoma thought about Abena's face when she'd spoken in the suite. The tablet, the schedule review, the quiet efficiency that Kiyoma had read as loyalty and that she was now reading as something else. The performance of someone who was watching a clock and managing the distance between now and the moment when her part in this was no longer needed. Get the car ready, Jitai on his phone. Side entrance. He'd known when he made that call that the KFIU notice was already in motion. He'd walked out of this ballroom, not in defeat, but in tactical retreat, removing himself from the room before the notice became public knowledge, before the seizure orders hit the accounts, before the guests who remained could watch him react to it. He hadn't broken. He had moved. And she had watched him go and felt something that she now recognized with the particular cold clarity of a woman who had spent 9 years thinking 3 moves ahead and had just discovered she'd been playing on the wrong board entirely, as relief. She had felt relief when he left, because she had believed it was over. It wasn't over. "I need to call Osi," Cairo said, already bringing the phone back up. "Not here," Kioma said. "Not in this room." She looked at the doors, the main entrance, the service corridor, the emergency exits along the south wall. "We need to move, all 3 of us. The guests, Iki, will be here when we're done." She picked up her clutch from the table. Her movements were precise, deliberate. Nothing wasted, nothing that communicated the thing that was happening in her chest. The specific sensation of a structure you have built over years developing a fracture line that you hadn't drawn, hadn't planned for, hadn't accounted for in any of the 9 years of accounting for things. Right now we need 4 walls and no audience. Cassius was already moving toward the service corridor. Cairo fell in beside his mother, close enough that his arm was within reach of hers without touching it, and she noticed this. Noticed the specific calibrated proximity of a son who had learned, somewhere in the years of not having her, how to be near someone without presuming, and she filed it in the part of herself that was not thinking about the next 30 minutes. They moved through the ballroom. The guests parted, not because anyone directed them to, but because the 3 of them moving together with that particular quality of directed motion created a kind of gravity that crowds responded to automatically. Someone called Kioma's name. She didn't turn. Someone else said something in Korean that she didn't catch. Min Jae-hyun watched them go from his position near the head table, his face unreadable, making no move to follow or to stop them. The service corridor was narrow and fluorescent and smelled of industrial cleaning solution and the particular overheated metal scent of a commercial kitchen running at full capacity. 2 of the catering staff flattened themselves against the wall when Kioma and her sons came through, recognizing, correctly, that this was not a moment to ask questions. Cassius found an empty prep room 20 feet down the corridor, a space used for staging serving equipment, stainless steel shelving units and stacked trays, and the industrial hum of a refrigeration unit running in the adjacent wall. He pulled the door shut behind them. The fluorescent light above them buzzed at a frequency that set the teeth on edge. Kioma stood in the center of the room and let herself be still for exactly 5 seconds. 5 seconds in which she did not perform composure, did not manage her expression or her breathing or the specific tension that had been living in her upper back for the past 4 hours. Just let herself exist inside the full weight of what she was carrying. Then she said, "Tell me what's recoverable." Cairo leaned against the shelving unit and pulled up something on his phone. A financial modeling application he had built himself 18 months ago, specifically for scenario analysis in situations where the standard tools weren't fast enough. The logistics network is clean. Everything Cassius built runs through Korean registrations that aren't touched by the KFIU notice. The real estate holdings, the 14 commercial properties, those are also clean. The Kang Tower position. "We don't have the tower," Cassius said. "We have a 41% stake, which doesn't give us operational control, which means Jitae can walk back into that building tomorrow morning if the Mauritius entities are frozen, because without the controlling position, we can't block him." "He won't go back to the tower," Kioma said. Both of them looked at her. "Think about what he just heard," she said, "in front of 600 people. The audio. The financial structure. He walked out of that room not because he was defeated. He walked out because he understood that the room was no longer the battlefield. He'll regroup somewhere that isn't on record, somewhere the KFIU can't immediately reach, and he'll start rebuilding from the operations that Cassius couldn't fully penetrate. The Northern Corridor. The Manchurian connection. The Manchurian connection is thin," Cassius said. "I cut 70% of the routing." 70% isn't finished, she said. "And a man with 30% of something that generates what that corridor generates has enough to rebuild." The refrigeration unit hummed. Somewhere beyond the corridor wall, the ballroom was audible as a distant, indistinct roar. The sound of 600 people in a space that had lost its architecture for the evening and was now just a collection of individuals trying to determine what the night meant for them. Cairo set his phone down on the nearest shelf and looked at his mother with the look he used when he was about to say something she wouldn't like. She had come to know this look in 4 years. She had come to trust it. "The complaint Lee filed," he said. "It's not just about the Mauritius vehicles." She waited. "It names you personally. Fraud and criminal conspiracy. The filing puts your name alongside the entity names as the controlling individual." He paused. "If the KFIU moves on this tonight, which they will, if Lee has the connections I think he does, they'll issue a hold on your personal accounts by morning. Travel restrictions within 48 hours. The room was quiet enough that the fluorescent buzzing was the loudest thing in it. "He's not trying to take back the business," Cassius said slowly. He was working through it in real time. She could see it. The way his eyes moved slightly left when he was thinking. A habit she had noticed and had not mentioned because it was the kind of thing you didn't mention. It was the kind of thing you simply knew about a person and kept. "He's trying to take back you. Immobilize you. If you can't move, can't access funds, can't..." "Then the structure we built has no center," Cairo finished. "The entities all run through her authorization chain. If she's legally compromised..." "The whole thing stalls," Kioma said. She turned and looked at the stainless steel shelving unit nearest to her. She looked at her own reflection in it, distorted, the fluorescent light doing unflattering things to everything it touched. Her black dress reduced to an indistinct dark shape, her face a pale blur with the general structure of her features but none of their precision. An approximation of herself. She had spent 9 years being more precise than this. She had spent 9 years accounting for everything she could think of, and she had not thought of this. Had not thought of Lee Dong-soo in a room somewhere in this city at 4:17 in the afternoon, typing her name into a legal complaint while she was upstairs in suite 4701, applying red lipstick and believing she had accounted for everything. The anger that moved through her was not hot. It was the specific cold anger of someone who has been meticulous and has discovered a gap in their meticulousness. And the coldness of it was worse than heat, because heat burned out, and this would not burn out. This would remain. This precise and pressurized fury at herself for the variable she had missed. "There's a way out of the personal exposure," Cairo said. She turned. "It requires moving assets before the hold is issued. Tonight. The window is maybe 4 hours, maybe less, depending on how fast Lee's connections move." He looked at his phone. "Osei can route through the Lagos entities. Your grandmother's network, the parts that predate your marriage, the parts that have never had any connection to Kang Group Holdings. If we move the authorization chain through those before the KFIU issues the hold, the personal exposure becomes complicated," Cassius said, echoing the lawyer's word from earlier, and despite everything, despite the red emergency lighting and the fluorescent buzzing and the 4 hours of this that her body was beginning to register as exhaustion in the specific places that exhaustion settled first, the back of the neck, the space behind the eyes. Despite all of it, the echo of Lee Dong-soo's word in Cassius's mouth almost made her smile. Almost. "Call Osei," she said to Cairo. "Tell him 4 hours. Tell him we need the Lagos Bridge active by midnight." She looked at Cassius. "I need you to find Abena." His expression changed. "Not for..." She stopped, started again. "I need to understand what she told them. Not to punish her, to know what Ji-Tai knows. If he knows the Lagos connection exists, the bridge is already compromised and Osei moves for nothing. I need to know if she knew about Lagos." Cassius nodded slowly. "She may not be in this building anymore," he said. "No, but Ji-Tai's people will know where she is. And right now, Ji-Tai's people are making decisions about which side of this they want to be on." She thought of Min Jae-hyun standing near the head table in the ballroom with his arms at his sides. "Start with Jae-hyun. You trust him now?" "I trust that he's a practical man who walked across a room tonight because he calculated that it was the right direction to walk. That calculation hasn't changed." She paused. "He'll give you Abena's location if he has it, and he might have it." Cassius straightened. He adjusted his jacket, a small, automatic gesture, the gesture of someone preparing to go back into a space that required a different version of themselves. And he looked at his mother one moment longer than was strictly necessary for the handoff of information, and in that look was everything that the evening had contained and everything that the years before it had contained, and everything that neither of them had the time or the vocabulary to address right now. Go, she said. He went. The door to the prep room swung shut behind him. Kioma and Cairo were alone in the buzzing fluorescent light for the first time since he had walked through the ballroom doors 2 hours ago. He was on his phone already, pulling up Osei's contact, but he was watching her while he did it. That peripheral awareness that she had noticed in him from the very first conversation. The quality of a person who could do two things at once because they had learned, somewhere in the years of being alone with whatever they were, to divide their attention without losing either thread. She sat down on a stainless steel prep table. The dress was not designed for sitting on prep tables. The fabric pulled slightly across her hips, a small inelegance, and she didn't adjust it. Let it pull. Let the evening be on her body the way it was on her body. You're okay, Cairo said. Not a question. No, she said. He looked at her directly. I'm not okay, she said, but I'm functional. There's a difference. She looked at her hands in her lap, the hands she had pressed flat on the table out there, the hands that had removed the wedding ring and hidden it in a lipstick tube 6 hours ago in a suite upstairs while she believed she had thought of everything. I missed it. Abena, I had 11 years of working with that woman and I missed what she was doing in the last 8 months. You trusted her. I trusted her because I needed to trust someone, which is the same reason anyone misses anything. She looked up at the fluorescent light. I taught myself to be careful about everyone except the people I couldn't afford to be careful about. That's the mistake. Cairo was quiet for a moment. Then, the Lagos Bridge. Even if it works tonight, even if we get the authorization chain moved before the hold, the Mauritius entities are still frozen. The controlling positions in Jite's corporate chain are still, I know. Which means tomorrow morning he can contest the acquisitions in court. I know, Cairo. And with Lee filing the fraud complaint, the contestation has grounds, and the court's here, Cairo. She said his name not loudly, not with heat, just with the specific weight of a mother saying a son's name to make him stop. He stopped. She looked at him. I know what we're facing. Tell me what we have. He swallowed, recalibrated. The analyst in him reasserting over the son who was looking at his mother sitting on a prep table in a black dress that had been built for a different kind of evening. The logistics network, the real estate, the 41% tower position, and Cassius's operational relationships in the shipping corridor. The people who moved from Jitai's network to ours, they're not going to move back. That bridge is burned. That's not nothing, she said. It's not everything. No, she agreed. It's not everything. She stood up from the prep table. She smoothed the front of her dress with one hand. That one hand, the same gesture she had made in the ballroom when she rose to speak. The gesture of a woman making herself precise again after something had pulled at the precision. She picked up her clutch. Call Osei, she said. Cairo raised the phone. It rang once. Osei answered on the second ring, and his voice, older than she remembered from 11 years ago, roughened by a decade of the work they had done together, came through the phone with the specific quality of a man who had been waiting for this call and was already in motion. I heard, he said before Cairo could speak. Lee's filing. I've been watching the KFIU system. The hold request is queued. It hasn't been issued yet, but the queue processing time at this hour is a pause, the sound of keys, rapid and purposeful. 2 hours, maybe 3 if the overnight processing is running slow. The Lagos Bridge, Cairo said. Can you activate it? A longer pause. Osei, Kioma said, loud enough for the phone to catch. Another pause. And then Osei Mensah said something that turned the floor of the prep room into the edge of a drop she hadn't known was there. Kioma, he said, there's something I have to tell you about the Lagos network. His voice had changed. The motion quality was gone from it. He was very still on the other end of the line, and she could hear the stillness, and it was the worst sound she had heard all evening. Something I should have told you 6 months ago. I didn't because I thought I could manage it without... I thought it wouldn't come to this. The fluorescent light buzzed above her. Cairo was looking at her. Tell me, she said. The Lagos entities, Osei said. 3 of the primary ones. The ones your grandmother's family built. The ones we've been using as the clean foundation. They were audited. 8 months ago. A private audit, not regulatory. Someone hired an investigative firm out of Singapore, and that firm found the connection between the Lagos entities and the Mauritius vehicles, and they documented it, and they... He stopped. Osei. They sold the report, he said. I don't know to whom. I've been trying to find out for 6 months and I can't trace it. But someone has a document that shows the Lagos Foundation is connected to the Mauritius structure, which means if Lee Dong-soo has access to that report, then the Lagos Bridge is already known, Kioma said. The words came out very flat, very quiet. Yes, Osei said. Cairo lowered the phone slowly. The call still live. Osei's breathing still audible through the speaker, and he looked at his mother in the buzzing fluorescent light of the prep room with the expression of a man who had built something enormous over years and was watching the ground. The ground beneath them had not disappeared. It had simply revealed itself to be smaller than they believed. Kioma stood in the fluorescent buzz of the prep room and let Osei's last words settle through her the way cold water settles. Not absorbed, just moving through, finding the lowest point, pooling there. Cairo had the phone at his side still, Osei's breathing still audible through the speaker, a thin thread of sound connecting this room to a man sitting somewhere in Accra who had carried a 6-month secret and had just set it down in the worst possible moment. She took the phone from Cairo's hand. Osei, she said. I'm here. The Singapore firm. Do you have their report? A partial copy. They redacted the source documentation before. Send it to Cairo's secure address. Everything you have. Right now, while we're talking. She paused. And Osei, when this is finished, you and I are going to have a very long conversation about what 6 months means. A beat of silence. I know, he said. She ended the call. She handed the phone back to Cairo and watched him pull up the secure address and confirm receipt pending, his thumbs moving across the screen with the speed of someone whose hands knew the motions before the mind fully issued the instruction. He was sweating slightly along his hairline. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, cataloged it, set it beside the other data points of the evening. Her son was afraid. Not for himself. She understood the distinction because she understood him, in the way that you understand someone whose face you have been reading for 4 years, with the specific attention of someone who had not been able to read it for 20. The partial report, she said. How fast can you assess it? 15 minutes to understand what they found. Another 10 to know if it kills the Lagos option completely or just complicates it. You have 10, she said. I'll be back. Where are you cut? To find Cassius. She opened the prep room door. The service corridor was no longer empty. 2 of the catering staff had retreated further down toward the kitchen, speaking in low, rapid voices. Closer to the ballroom end, one of Jite's security detail, a large man she recognized as the one who wore his earpiece on the left, which was the less dominant side, which she had catalogued 3 hours ago as a potential physical asymmetry worth knowing, was standing at the corridor junction with his back to her, talking into his sleeve. She walked toward him. He heard her heels and turned, registered her. His body language went through 3 states in approximately 1 second. Recognition, uncertainty, the beginning of a decision about what to do with a woman who had just dismantled his employer's empire in front of 600 people and was now walking toward him in a service corridor. Where's Cassius? She said. He stared at her. The young man in the cream suit, she said. Where did he go? I don't... You've been in this corridor for 6 minutes, she said. You saw him come through. Where? The man's jaw worked. He was perhaps 32, built for physical intervention rather than complex decision-making, and the evening had placed him in a situation that exceeded his professional framework in several directions simultaneously. His employer had left through the side entrance. His operational chain of command had gone silent, and the woman standing in front of him had, in the last 2 hours, demonstrated a particular kind of authority that had nothing to do with physical size and everything to do with the specific quality of someone who had already accounted for whatever you were about to do. 43rd floor, he said. The private conference room. He went up with... He stopped. With who? The man's throat moved. Min Jae-hyun. She walked past him toward the elevator bank. The 43rd floor of the Kong Tower was the executive level, not the syndicate's operational space, which lived in the floors above, but the legitimate business face, the floor with the glass-walled conference rooms, and the view of the Han River, and the kind of furniture that cost more than most people's cars. The elevator required a key card above the 38th floor. She had one, had obtained it 14 months ago through a property management company that held the building's maintenance contract, using a subsidiary of a Lagos entity that had no visible connection to anything she was associated with. The elevator opened onto a corridor of dark wood and muted lighting. The emergency power situation hadn't fully resolved. The overhead lights were running at 60%, giving the space a late-night quality that was not entirely unpleasant if you weren't paying attention to why it was happening. She heard Cassius's voice before she found the room. Not loud. Cassius was never loud, but the specific register of it, the register he used when he was making a point that he intended to be permanent, carried through the conference room door with enough clarity that she caught the shape of it before she turned the handle. She opened the door. Cassius was standing at the far end of the conference table, both hands resting on its surface, leaning forward at an angle that communicated exactly the kind of pressure he was applying without needing to raise his voice. Min Jae-hyun was seated across from him, jacket off, collar open, with the look of a man who had been in difficult conversations before and recognized that this was one of them. And seated to Jae-hyun's left, in a chair that had clearly been chosen for her rather than by her, was Abena. Kyoma stopped in the doorway. Abena looked up. 11 years. 11 years of this woman's face across breakfast tables in 4 different cities, across the back seats of cars and the margins of meetings and the quiet hours of hotel rooms when the work had gone long and the only company left was the person who knew all of it. 11 years of a face that Kyoma had read as loyal because she had needed it to be loyal, and had never once asked herself whether that need was distorting her reading. Abena's face right now was the face of someone who had been crying and had stopped, and the stopping looked like it had required effort. Her eyes were red-rimmed and her jaw was set, and she was sitting with her hands folded in her lap with the specific stillness of someone who had made their decision and was now simply waiting for the consequences to arrive. She didn't look away from Kyoma. That was something. Kyoma didn't know yet what it was something of, but she filed it. "Leave us," Kyoma said. Cassius looked at her, a question in it. "Take Jae-hyun. Wait outside." She looked at Min Jae-hyun. "I need 5 minutes with her." Jae-hyun stood without argument. He retrieved his jacket from the back of his chair with the economical movements of a man conserving energy for whatever came next, and he nodded at Kyoma. A small, specific nod, the kind that carried acknowledgement without apology, and he moved toward the door. Cassius followed, but paused beside his mother. "Lagos is compromised," she said quietly. "Cairo knows. Tell Jae-hyun I need to know if the Manchurian connection can be blocked from outside the syndicate structure. He'll understand what that means." Cassius looked at her for one moment. Then he went through the door and pulled it shut. Kyoma walked to the conference table. She pulled out the chair directly across from Abena and sat in it. She set her clutch on the table between them. She looked at Abena. Abena looked back. "How much did you give him?" Kyoma said. Abena's hands tightened in her lap. The gala date, the timeline, the structure of the Mauritius entities, the ownership chain, not the legal instruments. I didn't have the instruments. How long? A breath. The first contact was 14 months ago. 14 months. A month before Kyoma had instructed Abena to clear her schedule for the first full operational review of the acquisition timeline. A month before Abena had sat across from her in a Lagos hotel room and listened to Kyoma lay out the complete architecture of 9 years of work. "Who contacted you?" "Lee's office. A paralegal I didn't recognize. She said she was doing background research on Kang Group's asset structure for a regulatory filing. It seemed..." Abena stopped, started again. "It seemed like a routine inquiry. I told her nothing the first time. The second contact was Lee himself." "What did he offer you?" Silence. "Abena." "My family in Accra." Her voice was flat and careful, the voice of someone delivering a statement they have rehearsed because they needed the rehearsal to get through it. "My brother has a debt, a significant one, to people who are not patient about significant debts. Lee said he could make that problem disappear. He said..." Her jaw tightened. He said it would cost me very little. Just timing, just the date and the structure. He said no one would be hurt. Kioma sat with that for 3 seconds. Do you believe him? She said. Now, tonight. Do you believe no one would be hurt? Abena looked at the table. No, she said. The Lagos connection, Kioma said. Did you know about it? I knew the Lagos entities existed. I didn't know their relationship to the Mauritius vehicles. You kept that separate. I did, Kioma said. Yes. She thought about the Singapore audit report that Osei was transmitting to Cairo right now. Thought about the investigative firm that had found the Lagos-Mauritius connection independently, without Abena's knowledge, 8 months ago. 2 separate attacks on the same structure, from 2 separate angles, neither one aware of the other. Lee Dong-soo had been thorough. She had known he would be thorough. She had simply underestimated what thorough looked like when it was pointed directly at her. Your brother's debt, she said. How much? Abena looked up. How much? Kioma said again. Abena told her. Kioma nodded once. I'll cover it, she said. The expression on Abena's face moved through several things in rapid succession, none of them simple. Why? She said. Because your brother's problem is real, and Lee Dong-soo used it, and those are 2 different things. She stood. She picked up her clutch. You're done for tonight. Don't leave the building. Don't contact anyone outside this floor. When this is finished, we're going to sit down and figure out what comes next for you, and that conversation is going to be very honest. But right now I don't have time for it. She moved toward the door. Kioma, Abena said. She stopped. The Lagos entities, Abena said. I told you I didn't know the relationship to the Mauritius structure. That's true. But I knew, Lee told me in the second conversation, that he had a separate source who had documented the connection. He didn't tell me who. He told me to make sure I had the gala date confirmed before that source's information became actionable. A pause. I think the Singapore report was already in Lee's hands before he ever contacted me. I think he used me to confirm the timeline, the structural information I gave him. I think he already had most of it. Kioma stood very still. He didn't need me for the content, Abena said. He needed me for the date. The date. The execution date. The one piece of information that Lee Dong-soo could not have obtained from a financial audit or a Singapore investigative firm. The specific night on which Kioma intended to move, the night that everything was timed to, the night the KFIU complaint needed to be filed to be maximally effective. He had used Abena not as his primary source but as his calendar, which meant the Singapore report had been the real weapon, and Abena had simply been the trigger mechanism, and somewhere in that sequence was a different shape of betrayal, less personal, more architectural, that Kioma needed to understand before she could respond to it correctly. She opened the conference room door. In the corridor, Cassius was standing with Min Jae-hyun in the low executive floor lighting, and the conversation they'd been having stopped when she came through the door, and both of them looked at her with the specific attention of people waiting for direction. The Manchurian connection, she said to Jae-hyun. Can it be blocked? Jae-hyun's expression moved carefully. Not from outside, he said. The route controllers in that corridor answer to 2 people. Ji-tae is one. The other is a man named Cho Byung-suk. He runs the Dandong crossing. He doesn't answer to the syndicate structure formally. He has his own arrangement. Cho, Cassius said. Something in his voice. You know him, Kioma said. We had contact 18 months ago. He was interested in our logistics structure. We couldn't offer him what Jitai was already providing, so the conversation ended. He paused. But it ended clean. No hostility. Call him, Kioma said. Cassius looked at her. And say what? That the arrangement he has with Jitai is about to become very legally complicated, and that you have an alternative that doesn't carry that complication. She looked at Jae-hyun. Is that accurate? Jae-hyun considered. Cho is practical, he said. He's been Jitai's man for 11 years because Jitai was reliable. Tonight has changed the definition of reliable. Then call him, she said to Cassius again. Her phone vibrated. Cairo. She answered. The Singapore report, Cairo said. He was speaking fast, the speed of someone who had processed information and was now delivering it before the processing degraded. Osei's partial copy covers 60% of what the firm documented. The Lagos-Mauritius connection they found is real, but it's inferential. They traced the investment patterns and identified a probable relationship, but they don't have the legal instruments. They don't have the actual transfer documents that prove the connection. She felt something shift. Which means, she said, which means Lee's complaint, the KFIU filing. It references the Singapore report as supporting documentation, but if the report's connection is inferential rather than documentary, the KFIU hold can be contested. It's not automatic. It requires a hearing. A pause. We have a window. Small, but there's a window. How small? The hearing would need to be filed tonight, before the hold processes. We need a Korean attorney who can move right now at... She heard him check his phone. 11:47 at night, and file a contestation that gets in front of the hold request before it clears the queue. 11:47. The gala had started at 8. Less than 4 hours had dismantled and partially rebuilt the entire architecture of 9 years. Jae-hyun, she said, who is Lee Dong-soo's primary competition in Korean financial law? Jae-hyun didn't hesitate. A woman named Park Ji-young. She's been trying to take Lee's practice apart for 15 years. Professional rivalry that got personal. She takes cases specifically to oppose him. Does she take calls at midnight? If the case is against Lee Dong-soo, Jae-hyun said, she answers on the first ring. Get her number, Kyoma said. She was already moving back toward the elevator. Behind her, she heard Jae-hyun on his phone, heard Cassius beginning a different call. Cho Byung-suk, the Dandong crossing, the 30% of the Manchurian corridor that was still Jitai's operational lifeline. And she stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 42nd floor and watched the doors close and stood alone in the mirrored box of it for the 11 seconds it took to descend one floor. In the mirror, she looked at herself. The dress was still black. The lipstick had faded to a suggestion of red. Her eyes were the same eyes they had been at 7:42 when she'd stood in suite 4701, but they were looking at her differently, or she was looking at them differently, because the woman who had gone into this evening with a complete plan and absolute certainty was not the woman who was coming back out of it, and the difference between those two women was not defeat and it was not victory. It was something that had no clean name but felt, in the 11 seconds of the elevator's descent, like the specific rawness of a person who has discovered that the thing they are capable of is larger than the thing they had planned for. The doors opened. The ballroom was a different room than the one she'd left an hour ago. The 600 guests had reorganized into something between a cocktail party and a crisis meeting. Clusters of people in animated, low-voiced conversations, several tables abandoned entirely. The catering staff moving through the space with the careful neutrality of people who had been trained to be invisible and were currently very grateful for that training. The orchestra had packed their instruments. The grand chandeliers were back at full power. Someone had restored the main electrical supply. And the light after an hour of red emergency dimness felt aggressively bright. Cairo was at the head table when she got back to it. He had his laptop open. He had retrieved it from somewhere. The associate's bag, perhaps? The operational kit they had staged in the building earlier in the week. And he was moving between 3 windows with the focused speed of someone for whom time had become the only relevant variable. Park Ji-young, she said, sitting beside him. He didn't look up. Jae-hyun sent the number. I'm pulling the KFIU queue data right now to confirm the hold hasn't processed. His jaw was tight. The sweat along his hairline had spread slightly. Mom. What? Jitae is back in the building. She went still. Security camera, Cairo said, turning the laptop toward her. Side entrance, 4 minutes ago. He came back. He came. The footage was grainy. The timestamp in the corner reading 23:51. A figure in a charcoal tuxedo moving through the side entrance of the Kang Tower's ground floor, flanked by 2 men. The angle wasn't perfect. The camera was positioned for the entrance, not the approach. But the posture was unmistakable. The angular frame, the controlled economy of movement, 63 years of a man who had never allowed himself to appear anything other than deliberate. He had left. He had regrouped somewhere in the 43 minutes between his exit and now, and he had come back. He's going to the operational floor, Kyoma said. 54th, Cairo confirmed. That's where the core servers are. The syndicate's communication network runs through infrastructure on 54 that isn't covered by any of our acquisition documents because it's not technically a business asset. It's embedded in the building's own systems. He paused. If he reestablishes communication with the route controllers from 54 before Cassius reaches Cho, how long to get to 54 from the side entrance? Elevator. 3 minutes, maybe 4. She looked at the timestamp on the camera footage, 23:51. Current time, 23:54. 3 minutes. She stood. Call Park Ji-young, she said to Cairo. File the contestation. Don't wait for me. Where? But she was already moving, and the room parted for her again, the way it had when she'd arrived, but differently now. Not the parting of people making way for a woman making an entrance, but the parting of people instinctively clearing space for something that was moving with a particular and unmistakable velocity. And several of the guests who watched her cross the ballroom floor toward the service corridor would later, in the weeks that followed, struggle to describe what they had seen in her face. Not anger, not fear. Something colder than both. Something that had been built over 9 years and tested tonight and had not broken, not completely, and was now moving toward the last confrontation of this evening with the specific quality of a woman who understood that what she was walking toward was the thing the whole 9 years had been building to, and that there was no version of herself that could send someone else to do it. She took the elevator to 54. The doors opened onto a corridor she had never been in but had the blueprints for, had studied them 8 months ago in a Lagos hotel room with a cup of tea going cold on the table beside her, while she committed the layout to a memory she had spent 51 years training. The operational floor was darker than the executive level, industrial, functional, the lighting utilitarian rather than architectural, the kind of space designed for equipment rather than impression. The server room was at the far end. The door was open. She walked toward it, and in the doorway, she stopped. Jite was at the main console, his jacket off, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, both hands moving across the interface with the speed of someone who knew this system the way he knew his own name. He had not heard her approach. The server room's ambient noise was considerable, the cooling systems running at full capacity, a constant mechanical breathing that absorbed the sound of heels on industrial flooring. One of his security men was in the room. The other, she'd passed him in the corridor, she realized, had registered a shape in her peripheral vision and had not stopped, which meant he was behind her now, which was information she filed and kept. She stepped into the doorway. Jitai looked up. For a moment, 1 full second, they looked at each other across the server room with all of it between them. 25 years, 2 sons, 9 years of construction and 4 hours of execution, and the specific complicated catastrophe of a marriage that had been a transaction from the beginning and had cost more than either of them had invoiced for. You came back, she said. It's my building, he said. For now, she said. Step away from the console. His hands didn't move from the interface. The contestation Cairo just filed, he said. Park Ji-young. Bold choice. A pause. She's good, but the KFIUQ is being monitored, she said, by someone better. His jaw tightened. Jite. She stepped into the room. The security man behind her moved. She heard it, the shift in weight, the preparing movement, and she said, without turning, Don't. Said it the way you say something to an animal that is about to make a mistake, with the calm certainty of someone who knows the animal will hear the register even if it doesn't understand the word. The movement stopped. She walked toward the console. Jite watched her come. He didn't move away from it, but he didn't move toward her either, which was its own communication. The calculation of a man deciding in real time whether the thing in front of him represented a threat he could manage or one that had moved past the point where management was the relevant framework. She stopped 4 feet from him. He was 63 and lean and had spent a lifetime being the most dangerous person in whatever room he occupied, and there was still something in the physical fact of him, standing in this room with his sleeves rolled up and his eyes doing the thing they did when he was calculating, that she recognized and could not pretend not to recognize, because 25 years left marks on a person that were not always the marks the person would have chosen. She looked at his hands on the console. What are you trying to send? She said. A message to Cho Byung-suk, he said. Cassius's call. She kept her face even. Cho isn't going to receive it the way you want him to. Something moved in his expression, a question forming that he wasn't sure he wanted to ask. Cassius called him 12 minutes ago, she said. I don't know what they said, but Cassius has been building a relationship with that corridor for 18 months, and you have been taking Cho for granted for 11 years, and those are not the same starting position. Jitae looked at the console. He looked at her. And then he did something she had not expected, something that in 25 years she had never seen him do. Not in crises, not in moments of pressure, not in the private spaces of a marriage that had been, even at its worst, always characterized by a particular kind of forward motion on his part, the motion of a man who didn't allow himself to become static. He stepped back from the console, just one step, but back. You planned this for 9 years, he said. Yes, and you're telling me it isn't finished. It isn't finished, she said, not the way I planned it, but it's further than it was this morning, and tomorrow it will be further than it is right now. He looked at her for a long time, and then Kiyoma's phone vibrated in her hand, and she looked at the screen, and it was Cairo, and she answered it, and Cairo said 4 words that changed the shape of the next 60 seconds in ways that neither she nor Ji-Tai, standing 4 feet apart in the mechanical breathing of the server room on the 54th floor, were entirely prepared for. The hold just cleared, Cairo said. The hold just cleared. 3 words that meant the Korean Financial Intelligence Unit had processed Lee Dong-soo's complaint and frozen the Mauritius entities before Park Ji-young's contestation could reach the queue. 3 words that meant 63% of the acquisition structure Kiyoma had spent 9 years building was now legally inaccessible, pending a hearing that could take weeks, and that whatever leverage she had walked into this building with tonight had just been surgically reduced. She stood in the server room on the 54th floor with the phone at her ear and Ji-Tai 4 feet away watching her face. She did not let it show. How much time before the contestation is reviewed? She said into the phone. Park says 72 hours minimum, Cairo said. His voice was tight. The specific tightness of someone who had been running calculations for the last 4 hours and had just hit a result they didn't want. The KFIU hearing officer won't be available until Thursday at the earliest. Thursday. 2 days. 2 days in which Ji-Tai, if he moved correctly, could use the frozen period to contest the remaining acquisitions, reinstate his legal standing in the corporate chain, and begin the process of unwinding everything that hadn't already cleared. The logistics network, she said, Cassius's registrations. Still clean, the KFIU notice doesn't touch them. A pause. And Cho called back. She waited. He's out, Cairo said. He told Cassius he's done with the Manchurian arrangement, effective immediately. He cited, and this is a direct quote, structural instability in the Northern Partnership. Jitae heard that. She could see it in the slight shift of his weight, the micro-adjustment of his jaw. He hadn't heard the words. She was the only one with the phone against her ear. But he had read her face with the 25-year fluency of a man who had spent 2 decades studying a woman he had stopped seeing, and he had read enough. Cho was gone. The Manchurian lifeline was cut. I'll call you back, she said to Cairo. She ended the call and lowered the phone and looked at Ji-Tai. The hold cleared, he said. Not a question. Yes. Something moved through him. Not triumph exactly, something more complicated than triumph, because he was standing in a server room at midnight with the full comprehension of what this evening had cost him, regardless of what the KFIU had just done. And a man with Ji-Tai's intelligence did not confuse a tactical advantage with a strategic recovery. Cho, she said. His eyes sharpened. He's done with you, she said, as of 10 minutes ago. The silence between them had a different quality now than the silence that had existed in the ballroom 4 hours ago. That had been the silence of an audience holding its breath. This was the silence of 2 people standing at the end of something so long and complicated that the ending had no clean shape, no ceremony, no obvious moment at which you could point and say, there, that was it. That was when it finished. Jitae moved to the nearest server rack and leaned against it. Not a collapse. He didn't collapse, but a setting down of weight that his body had been carrying upright for 4 hours and that had reached its sustainable limit. He looked at the industrial floor between them and said nothing for a long time. She let him. The Mauritius freeze, he said finally. 2 days. At least. Park Ji-young is good. The contestation has grounds. It does, she agreed. Which means in 72 hours this goes to a hearing and both sides present documentation and a judge decides. He looked up. And you have better documentation. She said nothing. Because Lee's report is inferential, he continued. The analytical mind, the same mind that had built the Black Crane Syndicate from a mid-level criminal operation into the dominant power structure of Seoul's underworld over 30 years, was still running, still processing, even now, even here. She had always respected that mind, had spent 25 years watching it work and had never told him so, because there had been no context in which telling him would not have given him something he could use against her. The Singapore firm found the relationship between Lagos and Mauritius, but they couldn't document the instruments, which means Lee's complaint rests on inference plus my testimony, and my testimony tonight, he stopped, was recorded, she said. Yes. The audio that Cassius had played in the ballroom, Jitae's voice, his own words, documenting what he had done to his sons 24 years ago. Every person in a 600-person room had heard it. The recording existed on Cassius's phone and on 3 secure backup servers in different jurisdictions that she had established for exactly this contingency. That recording, Jitae said, in a Korean court, isn't about the Mauritius contestation, she said. You're right. The financial hearing is civil. The recording is a separate matter. She paused. A criminal matter. He understood what she was saying. She could see him understand it. Not with fear exactly, something more tired than fear. The expression of a man who had been very good at a very specific kind of chess for 30 years and was now seeing the full board for the first time and understanding that the game had been considerably larger than the board he thought he was playing on. What do you want? He said. The question was direct, stripped of everything that had surrounded every conversation they'd had for 25 years. The performance, the calculation, the management of surfaces. He was asking her in this server room with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, and the mechanical breathing of cooling systems around them, what she actually wanted. Not what her legal team wanted, not what the financial structure dictated. What she, Kioma Adeyemi, wanted from the ruins of this marriage and this empire and this night. She looked at him for a long time. The tower, she said. Full transfer of the 41% to majority. Operational control. She watched his face. The broadcasting licenses and the finance arm. I'll take the finance arm, you keep the licenses. They're worth less without the corporate chain anyway. She paused. The Mauritius contestation gets withdrawn by your legal team tomorrow morning. He was very still. In exchange, she said, the criminal complaint regarding the twins, the recording, the Incheon Clinic documentation, Yoon Tae-gwan's testimony, remains sealed, not destroyed, sealed, in the custody of a legal entity that Cairo controls. If the withdrawal happens and the transfer completes, it stays sealed permanently. The server room hummed. You're not asking for money, he said. I have money. You're not asking me to disappear. I'm asking you to step back, she said. Not disappear. Step back. The syndicate's legitimate business face becomes mine. The criminal operations, said, whatever you can still run without the corporate structure and without the Manchurian corridor and without Cho, that's your business. I'm not dismantling the man. I'm dismantling the empire he built on my back. Jitae looked at the floor. She waited. This was the part that could not be forced. She had spent 9 years engineering every variable she could reach, and tonight had revealed definitively that some variables could not be engineered. They had to be stood in front of and waited out, with the full weight of everything on the line and no guarantee of the outcome. She had been waiting for things her entire adult life. She could wait another 60 seconds. He looked up. The finance arm, he said. I want the Jeju properties included. The Jeju properties are in the real estate holding, she said. They're already mine. A long silence. Yes, he said. They are. He pushed off the server rack and walked to the console. He stood in front of it for a moment. Then he reached forward and closed the interface he had been working on when she arrived. The message to Cho Byung-suk that would never be sent, to a man who was already gone. He closed it with one deliberate key press and stepped back. I'll call Lee in the morning, he said. Tonight, she said. His jaw tightened. Jitai, she said. Tonight. Another silence. Then he reached into his trouser pocket and retrieved his phone and scrolled to a contact and pressed call. And in the server room's ambient mechanical breathing, she heard it ring twice before Lee Dong-su's voice came through. Alert. Immediately alert. The voice of a man who had been awake and waiting. And Jitai said in Korean 4 words that were the most expensive words he had ever spoken in a life full of expensive words. Withdraw the KFIU complaint. A pause on the other end. Do it tonight, Jitai said. Whatever you need to do. He ended the call. He put the phone back in his pocket. He picked up his jacket from where he'd laid it across a server rack, and he put it on, slowly, with the movements of a man performing a familiar ritual that now carried a different weight. He smoothed the lapels. He straightened the crane embroidered on the left side. He looked at her one last time. There was something in the look, not apology. He was not built for apology, and she had no use for it, but something that was adjacent to recognition. The look of a man who had decided 25 years ago that the woman he was marrying was a useful object, and who was standing tonight in the wreckage of that decision, and who was capable of understanding at last that the thing he had called useful had been, the entire time, the most dangerous person in every room they'd shared. He walked out. She heard his footsteps down the corridor, heard the elevator doors open and close. She stood alone in the server room for 43 seconds and did not move. Then she picked up her phone and called Cairo. He answered before the first ring completed. What happened? He's withdrawing this complaint, she said. Tonight. Watch the KFIU system. When you see the withdrawal process, call Park Ji-young and tell her to stand down. A pause. Then come to the 54th floor, both of you. She ended the call. She walked to the console and looked at it. The interface Jitai had closed, the dark screen, the blinking cursor that indicated a system waiting for instruction. She did not touch it. She had people who understood these systems better than she did, and tomorrow she would send them to this floor, and the day after that, the process of understanding exactly what lived in these servers would begin. Tonight, she simply stood in front of it and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. The weight was not light. Victory was the wrong word for what this was. She had known, when she started 9 years ago, that victory was the wrong frame. That the thing she was trying to do was not win something, but recover something. And recovery was a different shape than winning, messier and more expensive and without the clean edge that winning had. She had recovered her sons. She had recovered the years she'd spent in that marriage from the category of pure loss into something that had produced, even in its waste, the 9 years of work that had made tonight possible. She had not recovered the 24 years her sons had grown up without her. She had not recovered the 4 years she'd spent grieving children who were alive. She had not recovered the version of herself that had stood at a Lagos investment summit at 26 and believed she was choosing something freely. Those things were not recoverable. She had known that going in. The elevator opened and Cairo came through first, moving fast, with his laptop under one arm and his phone in his hand. Cassius was behind him, and Cassius had something in his expression that she recognized as the specific exhaustion of someone who had been operating at maximum capacity for 6 consecutive hours and whose body was beginning to file its objections. Cairo stopped when he saw her face. He withdrew it, he said. Not a question. He's withdrawing it, she said. Watch the system. He opened the laptop, set it on the nearest flat surface, a server rack casing, and pulled up the KFIU monitoring interface he had been running. He watched the screen. His eyes moved across the data with the rapid, practiced scan of someone who had been reading this kind of information for years. Cassius came to stand beside his mother. He didn't say anything. He stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool of the server room, and she was aware of it the way she was aware of things she had not expected. Fully, with the whole surface of herself, not just the working part. Cho really went, she said. In the time we were talking, he had already told his root controllers, Cassius said. Whatever Jitai was going to send from that console, there was no one left to receive it. She looked at the dark console screen. That was the moment, she said. That was when he made the calculation. The math stopped working for him, Cassius said. Yes. Cairo looked up from the laptop. The withdrawal just processed, he said. His voice had gone quiet with it. the specific quiet of someone watching a number change that represents years of work. The KFIU hold is releasing. It'll clear fully by morning, but the Mauritius entities are unfreezing now. He looked at her. It's done. The server room breathed around them. Done was also the wrong word. Done implied a finish line, and she had spent 9 years understanding that there were no finish lines. There were only new positions from which the next thing was built. But it was, at minimum, the end of tonight. And tonight had been the thing that everything else was built toward, and its ending deserved a moment of something before the next thing began. She put one hand on Cairo's shoulder. He stiffened slightly, the reflex of someone still learning how to be touched by this particular person, and then settled under it. She put her other hand on Cassius's arm. They stood in the server room for a moment, the three of them, in the hum of cooling systems and the blinking of status lights. In the building that was now, in the most real and legal and structural sense available, no longer Kangji Tai's. She let it last exactly as long as it needed to. Then she said, "Close the laptop, we're going down." They went down. The ballroom, when they returned to it, had thinned to perhaps 150 guests. The ones who had nowhere else to be, or who had decided that whatever was still happening in this building was more interesting than wherever they were supposed to go next. The caterers were beginning the quiet work of clearing tables. The orchestra's empty chairs stood in their semicircle like a diagram of something that had once been structured and was now simply a space. Min Jae-hyun was still there. He was at a table near the window with two of the syndicate captains, and all three of them had the look of men who had spent the last hour doing precisely what practical men did after watching power transfer in a room, calculating their positions in the new structure and determining what they needed to do to secure them. When Kiyoma walked back into the ballroom, Jae-hyun stood. The captains followed. She walked to them. "The Mauritius hold is releasing," she said. "Lee Dong-soo will confirm the withdrawal by morning. The transfer of operational control of the tower and the finance arm will process through our legal team in the next 72 hours. She looked at the three men evenly. "If any of you need time to consider where you stand and what comes next, take it. There won't be pressure on that decision, but I need people around me who've made the decision, not people who are still making it," Jae-hyun said without hesitation. "I've made it." The two captains exchanged a look. One of them, younger, with the particular wariness of someone who had survived in the syndicate structure by being very careful about which direction he committed to, said, "What does the operation look like, going forward?" "Cleaner," she said. "Everything Cassius built stays, the logistics network, the shipping routes. Those remain exactly what they are, because what they are is legal and efficient. The criminal operations that ran under Jitae's structure..." She paused. Let the pause do its work. "Those are your decision. I'm not Jitae. I'm not going to tell grown men what risks they choose to run in their own businesses. But those operations don't run under my name or through my structure. That line is not negotiable." The younger captain looked at her for a long moment. "Understood," he said. She nodded once. She left them there and walked to the window. The Han River was visible from this height at this hour. Dark, the city lights along its banks broken into fragments on the water's surface, a long and slow-moving darkness cutting through the lit city. She had stood at windows looking at this river many times in 25 years. It had always been someone else's window. Cassius came to stand beside her. "Where does he go?" he said. "Jitae?" She looked at the river. "Somewhere he still has something. The Jeju licenses. Whatever criminal operation he can run without the corporate structure." She paused. "He's 63. He's been doing this for 40 years. He doesn't know how to stop, so he won't stop. But what he builds from here will be smaller." She thought about the man she had watched leave through the service door 4 hours ago, and the man she had stood 4 feet from in the server room an hour ago, and the distance between those two versions of him that the night had created. He built his empire on the assumption that I was not paying attention. That assumption is gone. He'll build differently now. "Is that enough?" Cassius said. She turned to look at him. Her younger son, younger by 4 minutes, according to the medical record she had finally obtained 3 years ago, with his mother's eyes and his Vancouver accent and the hands of someone who had spent years doing physical work before the company he built could afford to hire people to do it for him. The son she had found last, who had asked what she needed from him before he asked what he needed from her. "No," she said honestly. It's not enough. Nothing is going to be enough for what he did. She looked back at the river. But it's what's real. And I spent 25 years inside something that wasn't real. I'd rather have what's real. Cassius nodded slowly. He looked at the river too. I want to show you something, she said. She reached into her clutch. She retrieved the lipstick tube, uncapped it, and twisted the base 3 times. The compartment clicked open. She removed the folded tissue paper and unwrapped it on her palm. The white gold ring sat in the center of her hand. Cassius looked at it. I was going to leave it on the table in front of him tonight, she said. That was the plan. A clean gesture, something symbolic. She closed her fingers around it slightly. And then the lights went out, and everything changed, and I never got to it. She paused. I'm glad I didn't. Why? Because leaving it on his table would have been for him, she said. A message for him, something he would have looked at and understood as being about him. She closed her hand fully around the ring. This is not about him anymore. She walked to the window. The glass was floor to ceiling, and the latch on the section nearest her was the kind that opened outward for ventilation. She pressed it, and the window swung out 3 inches, and the night air came in, cool, carrying the particular smell of a large city after midnight, exhaust and water, and the indefinable collective scent of millions of people living in proximity. She held her hand out through the gap. She opened her fingers. The ring fell. 42 floors. The Han River below. She didn't watch it go. She had already looked away when she released it, back into the room, back at her son's face, because the ring was not the point. The release was the point. The choosing to let go of a thing that had been on her hand for so long that the skin beneath it had changed shape, had grown around it, had incorporated it into the architecture of her body, and the choosing to let that shape readjust to the absence. Cassius said nothing. She latched the window. Cairo found them 20 minutes later, when the final calls had been made and the last of the financial confirmations had processed, and Park Ji-young had been thanked and released. He looked the way people look when something enormous is over. Not quite relief, not quite exhaustion, somewhere in the specific liminal space between the end of one thing and the beginning of the next, when the body doesn't yet know what to do with itself. The car is downstairs, he said. Abena, Kioma said. Cassius spoke to her. She's going to her sister's for now. He paused. The brother's debt. I can have Osei route the payment through the Lagos accounts tomorrow, if you still want to. I still want to, she said. He nodded. I'll set it up. She looked at him. Her older son, older by 4 minutes, who had found his way to a Lagos hotel room 4 years ago and had listened to her tell him everything and had not flinched, had not run, had said yes before she finished asking. She thought about the 20 years she had not known where he was. She thought about him building himself in Accra with the tools available to him, without her, into someone who could walk through the doors of this ballroom tonight and do what he did. She had not made him. She had simply found him already made. Let's go, she said. They went down through the building, the elevator, the lobby, the side entrance that Ji-tai had used 4 hours ago in his exit, and that she used now simply because it was the closest door, not because of what it meant or didn't mean. The night air outside was cooler than the river-scented breath that had come through the window, and the street was quiet the way Seoul streets were quiet after midnight. Not empty, never empty, but running at a lower frequency. The particular hum of a city whose daytime self had briefly withdrawn. The car was there. A black sedan, driver she trusted, engine running. She stopped on the sidewalk. Cairo and Cassius stopped beside her. She looked up at the Kong Tower. 60 stories. The name her husband had given it in the specific vanity of a man who needed everything around him to reflect himself back. She looked at the name on the building's face, lit against the night sky, and she thought about what it would look like when the name changed. When the lawyers processed the transfer and the holding company updated its documentation and the building's management company received the new operating authority. It would take weeks, maybe longer. But the night had already decided what the weeks would confirm. She looked at her sons. They looked back at her. There was so much that had not been said. So many years of it, 20 and more, the accumulated silence of growing up separately and without her. And the accumulated silence of her growing without them, all of it still sitting between them in the specific way that things sit between people who are real with each other, and do not pretend the weight doesn't exist. It would take time. It would take years, probably, to say the things that needed saying, and some of them would never come out right. No matter how long they tried, because some experiences didn't have language that fit them precisely, and you learn to live with the approximate. She had learned that. She suspected they had too. "Are you hungry?" she said. Cairo blinked. Then something happened to his face, a softening so sudden it looked almost involuntary. The face of someone whose body had decided to feel something before the mind could compose itself. "It's 1 a.m, he said. "I know what time it is," she said. "Are you hungry?" Cassius made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. "Yes," he said. "There's a place near Mapo Bridge," Kioma said. "Open all night. I've been going there since before either of you existed." She looked at both of them. "I want to take you there." Cairo looked at Cassius. Cassius looked at his mother. "Okay," Cairo said. They got in the car. The driver pulled away from the Kang Tower without being told where to go. Kioma had given him the address hours ago, had added it to the evening's itinerary in the same planning session where she had confirmed the orchestra's piece and verified Abena's access credentials and done all the other things that had made tonight what it was. She had planned for the end of the evening the same way she had planned for everything else, with the specific hopefulness of a person who believed that if you planned carefully enough, the thing you were hoping for might actually be waiting on the other side. The city moved past the windows, lit streets, the occasional cluster of late-night pedestrians, the wide, dark reach of the Han River as the car crossed the bridge. Kioma sat between her sons in the back seat and watched Seoul pass and said nothing. And neither did they, and the silence was not the silence of people who had nothing to say, but the silence of people who had so much to say that they were choosing, for now, simply to be in the same car, breathing the same air, crossing the same river. The restaurant was small and bright and smelled of broth and sesame and the particular warmth of a kitchen that had been running for decades. The woman behind the counter recognized Kioma, registered the black dress and the hour with the non-judgmental pragmatism of someone who had seen stranger things come through the door at 1 a.m, and showed them to a table in the corner without being asked. They sat. Kioma ordered in Korean. Cairo studied the laminated menu with the careful attention of someone encountering a language they'd worked hard to learn and were still calibrating. Cassius looked around the restaurant. The other late-night diners, a couple sharing a bowl near the window, 2 men in construction gear eating quickly. With the alert ease of someone who assessed spaces automatically and had found this one satisfactory. The food came fast. Plain, honest food, broth and rice and vegetables, and the particular simplicity of a meal that made no argument for itself beyond being what it was. Kioma ate. She ate more than she had eaten all evening, which was not difficult given how little she had managed through 12 courses of kaiseki at the gala, and the food was exactly what it had always been in this place, exactly what she had remembered in 9 years of planning, the specific, reliable comfort of a thing that had not changed while everything else was changing. Cairo tried his broth. He looked at her. "Good," he said. In Korean. She looked at him. "I've been practicing," he said. A slight self-consciousness in it, not embarrassment exactly, something more careful. The specific vulnerability of someone showing a thing they care about to a person whose opinion matters. "Your pronunciation is better than mine was at your age," she said. He looked down at his bowl, the softening again, the involuntary kind. Cassius was watching both of them with the expression of someone who was very accustomed to being the quieter one in a room and had made a life of understanding things through observation rather than participation. He looked, she thought, like someone who was learning in real time what it felt like to have a family that knew how to share a meal. She thought about what Jitai was doing right now, where he was, what room he was sitting in. She thought about Lee Dong-soo processing the withdrawal in whatever office he kept after midnight for situations that required after-midnight offices. She thought about Abena at her sister's, carrying what she was carrying. She thought about Min Jae-hyun and the syndicate captains, reorienting themselves in the dark toward a new center of gravity. She thought about all the moving pieces of the night still settling into their final positions, the way a structure settles after something has shifted beneath it. Small movements, almost imperceptible, continuing long after the main event. She set down her spoon. She reached into her clutch. She removed the small object she had kept in the inner pocket all evening. Not the lipstick, not the ring that was somewhere in the Han River now. A small wooden crane, no larger than her thumb, carved from a pale wood that had darkened slightly with age and with the oils of the hands that had held it. Her grandmother's hands first, then her mother's, then hers, for 25 years, in every city, in every hotel room, an apartment and house she had occupied as King Jitai's wife. This one object that had traveled with her from Lagos and that she had kept not because she needed it to remember her grandmother, but because her grandmother had understood something about endurance that she had been learning, slowly, over the course of a life. She set the crane on the table between the three of them. Cairo looked at it. Cassius looked at it. She didn't explain it. Some things didn't need explaining to the right people. Cairo reached out and touched it with one finger. Careful, brief, the touch of someone making contact with an object that they understood, without being told, was significant. Cassius looked at her face, then at the crane, then back at her face, and something in his expression settled, something that had been held in a particular tension all evening. The tension of a man who had arrived in a room 4 hours ago prepared to execute a plan and had been required to do something harder than that, had been required to be present inside the full complexity of who he was and where he came from, and what it meant to stand in a ballroom and walk to his mother for the first time and the last time simultaneously. That tension settled into something quieter, something that had the specific quality of a feeling that had found, at last, a place to land. The restaurant hummed around them. Seoul moved outside. The Han River moved in the dark. Kioma picked up the crane and held it in her palm and looked at it for a moment. Then she set it back on the table, in the center, equidistant from all three of them, and she picked up her spoon and she finished her meal. Outside the window, the city's lights were reflected in the river, broken, shifting, nothing like what they were from above, but real in their own way, carrying their own kind of meaning. A long, slow brightness moving through the dark toward wherever the water went. The crane sat on the table between them, small and pale and worn to smoothness. Still,